Prepare to be illuminated.
Hi guys, in this video we're going to be reviewing the Mechanicum deck in Horus Heresy Legions. As a neutral deck, the Mechanicum deck is generally weaker than any of the Space Marine decks are, but its cards can be used in any deck, just like the Imperial, Chaos, and Mechanicum decks. That does mean if you're building a Mechanicum deck, you can also include Imperial and Chaos cards. In general, the Mechanicum deck is probably more stable, more powerful than the other two neutral decks, at least that's my opinion. But it still lacks many of the hard-hitting abilities that a Space Marine deck and Space Marine tactics and units will have. Anyhow, let's start by running through what the Mechanicum do. So again, they've got two Warlords. One of them, Kelbor Hal, has 35 health, and Caleb Decima has 30 health. I'm going to start with Caleb Decima because he's simpler. He is essentially not a great Warlord. A lot of top players would love him to be, but because initially he sounds like he's good. Every time you play a Mechanicum troop, he refills 1 energy, and for 2 energy he can stun and deal 1 damage to the enemy Warlord. So it sounds as though he can keep the enemy permanently stunned. The problem is, in other decks, especially Space Marine decks, there's enough good units that if you're focusing on just stunning the enemy Warlord, ultimately you're going to get killed by his units instead, because you're using up most of your energy. Well, you're using up at least effectively 1 energy point a turn on trying to keep the enemy Warlord stunned, and he'll compensate for that with units. So Caleb Decima, not that great. Just like Ingathel, I do not recommend trying to use him. On the other hand, Kelbor Hal is a bit more complex. For the longest time, players were convinced that Kelbor Hal was equally, or if not more, useless than Caleb Decima was. And then there was a balancing change, and Caleb Hal's ability was changed so that as well as gaining 2 more energy when a friendly Mechanicum unit dies. So that means if one of your units dies on your turn, like for example while attacking, you gain 2 energy back. As well as that, for 0 energy, so for free, instead of attacking, Kelbor Hal can create a Mechadendrite card in your hand. And I'm going to talk about how those get used in a moment, but let's quickly go down the deck and look at the Mechadendrite cards which he can generate. So the Mechadendrite cards are special. You cannot include them in your initial starting deck of 30 cards, but they get created through various special abilities. So it's these 5 cards starting from Chaos Mechadendrite. So they all cost 1 energy to play. Chaos Mechadendrite just acts straight up like a Mark of Chaos, as we saw last turn. It gives a unit a random Mark of Chaos. So this is probably one of the least popular ones, unless you're trying to create demons, because you don't know what bonus a unit's getting, so it's hard to plan. You might create a medical Mechadendrite, which gives a unit +3 health, which can be extremely useful and can keep a unit that's dying alive, or make a unit with high attack but low health into a sudden beast of a unit. Offensive Mechadendrite gives a unit cleave 2, meaning when it attacks an enemy, it'll inflict 2 damage to each enemy to its left or right as well. So that turns the unit into an area damage unit, which can be great. Also, if you give a unit multiple offensive Mechadendrites, cleave will stack, so it can inflict 4 or 6 damage to neighboring units, which can be devastating. Optical Mechadendrite works similarly, except now you're just giving a straight up bonus to attack, like a Mark of Khorne, and you can stack Optical Mechadendrites on each other as well. And lastly, Utility Mechadendrite gives a unit shield, meaning the first time it takes any form of damage, it can ignore that. So Kelbor Hal every turn can generate 1 of these, and you can play as many Mechadendrites as you want onto a unit. And that means you can buff a unit into becoming extremely powerful. So there's some builds, especially where Kelbor Hal can be used with units like Merit's Mercenaries, which become stronger every time you play a card. And leveraging his ability to build up a stock of very cheap Mechadendrite cards, you can play a Merit's Mercenary, and then the next turn or the same turn play a ton of Mechadendrites and suddenly turn that guy into a super powerful unit which is buffed by all these Mechadendrites and becomes devastating. Alright, so that's Kelbor Hal. So essentially he's the only one of the Mechanicum Warlords who's feasible, and if you're skillful and build him right, he can be competitive at the very top end of the ladder. Okay, let's go into the units. Most of the Mechanicum units, personally, I consider to be slightly above average, and with some being truly excellent, but let's start with Arcadius. So Arcadius is one of the cheapest Mechanicum cards, costs only 1 energy, but he's super popular. You'll get him being used in all the decks because of his rally ability. When you play him, all enemies on the field lose stealth. When you first start playing the game, you will probably not face that many units with stealth. As you go up in the ladder and you start facing players, especially from the Raven Guard as well as some other faction, you're going to be frustrated because they're going to be powerful units in stealth throughout the match who you cannot harm because they're in stealth, and your defensive satellites aren't killing them because maybe you're rolling 1 damage instead of 4. Your artillery strikes are not doing enough damage to kill them, and you've got powerful units but they just cannot attack the enemy because they're in stealth. Arcadius removes stealth from everyone, all your enemies, so many of the best players will include Arcadius in their deck to try to deal with stealth targets. So yes, 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 5 thumbs up. Alright, Epsilon Sigma, though, he's much weaker. He's got fantastic health, but for 1 energy, he only has 1 attack. This guy's a bit of a waste of space in a deck. It's very rare to see him come out, so let's put him away. Life Support. This card is really useful, especially if you have Mechanicum troops with front line, because that way, when those frontline units die, they'll come back to life and they'll require 1 more hit to go away. So if you're planning on using Mechanicum frontline units, Life Support's a good one to include. If you don't have that many Mechanicum frontline units or special units who must stay alive, then this one can be skipped. Xenai 73 is pretty popular. Not for his stats, which are abysmal, 1 energy, 1 attack, 2 health, but whenever you play him, you immediately gain a free Mechadendrite. So he costs 1 energy but generates a Mechadendrite card for you, so that's worth it. Alright, next up is Alpha Rho. These guys normally would die very quickly, except they have stealth, so they become one of the few 1 energy units, which is very popular to have in your deck because they're quite likely to survive to the next turn, especially if you play them early on in the match when it's unlikely that the enemy is going to have many area effect abilities. Alright, next up, Ambassador Melgator. This guy competes with Goldstone's Hunters for being the best card in the game. The only reason why I considered Goldstone's Hunters to be better is Melgator is a legendary card, so you can only have 1 copy of him in your deck, meaning the statistical chances of getting Melgator into your hand are lower than Goldstone's, where you can get 2 of them in your deck. But Ambassador Melgator is a 2 energy card who's a get out of jail free card because he can return a troop to hand. Typically you're going to use this on a powerful enemy unit to buy you some time to get more units onto the board to deal with that guy when he returns, but sometimes you can use Melgator to get rid of your own units if you need to pull a unit back into your hand for whatever reason. Maybe that unit has a powerful rally ability of its own, maybe it's a powerful unit which is almost dead and you'd rather bring it into your hand and play it again when it gets healed up. Because when a card returns to your hand, it loses all damage which has been inflicted and all negative effects on it. Delta Psi 02. Now this card initially looks pretty bad. Yes, it has front line and it has 3 health, but only does 1 attack. But if you can combo this right, so you play this when you have a vehicle, it suddenly becomes a really powerful card for 2 energy. So this can be good under the right circumstances. If you're playing it without many vehicles, then I don't recommend it, because for a frontline unit with only 1 health, it's a mild inconvenience for the enemy. Design Flaw. This is a funny card because whenever you face a really powerful enemy vehicle, you're going to really wish you had Design Flaw, because that'll just make that unit into a easy dead target. Having said that, there's not that many decks out there which have very powerful vehicles in there, so most of the time people will not include design flaw because you'll never use it. However, every time you face a vehicle and it has like 9, 10 or 14 health, part of your mind will remember design flaw and think, wow, wouldn't that have been convenient to have right now? So I would normally skip this one, although its ability is great. You just don't face enough vehicles to make this a standard part of your deck. Ro Tao is another very popular little guy. It's a vehicle, so it's one of the cheapest vehicles in the game, in fact. It has stealth, and most of the time you're going to sit with this guy in stealth when and you try to use his ability. For 1 energy, a random enemy who's got stealth right now loses stealth. So he's a stealth detector, basically. He's a handy little guy. Early on in the game, while you're not facing Raven Guard and many stealth units, this guy's ability, you'll use him a little bit differently. He's just going to be handy as a 2 energy unit who will survive to your next turn, whereupon he will attack and die at that point. So it's a handy card under many circumstances. Alpha Zeta 5-4. I don't like this guy. If he survives long enough to trigger his ability, yes, he's pretty okay. But the issue is whether or not he survives. Most of the time he'll get killed pretty quickly. And even when he even including his ability, we will have spent 3 energy plus 1 to gain a unit which is frontline, 3 attack, 4 defense. But that already exists down here. When we see Epsilon Rho, they basically have the stats which this guy can get over 2 turns. So I don't like including him for that reason. Chi Upsilon 64. Remember Abisha from the Chaos deck? The guy who cost 1 and had 4 attack? Chi Upsilon is, I guess, him after he's been super modified or whatever. Well, I guess it's Chi Upsilon technically. At any rate, fantastic attack, but it's got tin for protection. It'll die if anything looks at it funny, so most of the time it's not there in many decks. Again, you could use it defensively by using it as a by forcing the enemy to react to that, but it's not a great way of doing it. So because anything which does damage is guaranteed to kill Chi Upsilon, so let's forget about him. Dark Engine Seer. This is weird. It's a Mechanicum card, but it helps Chaos heavy decks. So again, you're not going to include him if you're a Mechanicum deck, unless you're going to include this guy in a Chaos deck instead. And in that deck, it's super powerful. Just watch out, because when you play him, and if you have a Chaos heavy deck, your opponent will prioritize trying to take this guy out, because being able to play a card for 2 energy less can be a big game changer. Epsilon Alpha 63. This card is rare to be used. A big part of that is he has very little attack, so he's not that flexible. And there's not that many decks which use enough vehicles to justify having this guy around. So he's not super handy. Even when he's in event decks, he rarely gets used. On the other hand, Pi Alpha 54. These guys are used a lot, especially in decks with aggressive Warlords, who are going to be taking a lot of damage because they're constantly attacking. He actually has 2 benefits. One is that he does heal directly, but he also removes stuns. It can be very helpful for that reason as well. Now the other thing is, though, Pi Alpha 52 also has an important role to play in decks where your Warlord has low health. If you've got one of those Warlords with 30 health, you might seriously want to consider including this guy, because if you manage to draw 2 of these during your game, you will have healed up 6 health in total. So it will have been as though you started on 30. You had 36 health overall. So he's a pretty useful guy to have. You deploy him, you get healed, and he can like chip in with a useful 2 attack afterwards as well. Or with 2 defense, the enemy's going to have to put a little effort into killing him. So it's a good card. Shield Generator. Now this is one you very rarely see, but a lot of people theorize heavily around using Shield Generator. It's a card which cannot attack, which looks like it sucks, but it has shield, so it's hard to kill. But most importantly, it makes tactics cost more. So this can be extremely inconvenient for certain enemies who rely on tactics. What you could use this for example, if you're facing Angron, and he often relies in his late turns, or when he has 8 or 9 energy, he relies on a card called the Conqueror, which destroys all units in play. Shield Generator can make that card cost more and delay the time delay him using it until his turn with 10 energy. So you need to be very careful with how you plan to use Shield Generator. Most of the time when you play it, your enemy will hate it and try to kill it, but killing it is not easy. It takes a lot of effort, so it doubles up as a handy defensive unit as a result. Sibyllins are fantastic. These are one of the few units you want to die, but you want them to die at the right time when there's another enemy unit on the board, because then that unit will go back to hand. This is also useful if you've got Sibyllins deployed and the enemy plays a really powerful unit, because you can slam Sibyllin into them. Sibyllins will die, but as they die, they will send that enemy unit back to their hand. So back to the enemy's hand. So this card is really good. Advanced Schematics. If you remember when I did the Imperial Army review, I talked about the Compliance card, which costs 4 energy and reduced the cost of all Imperial Army units by 1. Advanced Schematics is a Mechanicum equivalent of that. It suffers from the same problems. On paper, this is an incredible ability. It's just hard to find a good time to play this. I would say if you're going to include this, only include 1 copy in your deck. Don't include 2, because you're never really going to get a chance to play 2 of them. And most of the time, you may not even need the card at all. So it's a card which sounds much better than it actually is. Alpha Theta 11. This is a good card. With 4 health, they're going to stick around for a long time. With 3 attack, they can be used offensively, but most importantly, every turn they survive, they create a Mechadendrite for you. And often what you'll see is people will use the Mechadendrite Alpha Theta generated immediately on Alpha Theta and attack with it. So it's a great card to include. You'll see it all the way through the ladder, including at the very top. It's one of the most popular Mechanicum cards. Delta Omega 42 is pretty good as well. It's a unit which dies if anything looks at it funny, but its rally ability is deal 2 damage, so it's a guaranteed 2 damage to the enemy. Plus, if it survives, it does 4 more damage as well. So it's a pretty good card. I like this one. It's a handy card to include. Most of the time, it's going to die before it gets to attack, but it will do 2 damage by then, so it's not a waste. Epsilon Row 32. This is a popular Mechanicum card. It's a really solid defensive unit. Costs 4 energy, but it has 4 health, so it'll often survive for at least 2 turns. And with 3 attack, it'll do a lot of damage to anyone who hits it as well. So this is a solid card. It's good. If you've got multiple Mechanicum troop cards or even structures of vehicles in your deck, you will want Last Howl. He will buff your Mechanicum cards and make them into beasts. Even he automatically buffs himself as well. So although it says his stats are 4-3, while he's in play, he's actually 5-4. So he is incredible. And if you've got 2 of these guys and you put them both down, they buff each other as well as Mechanicum, other Mechanicum units. So 2 Last Hauls together on the board will have 6 attack and 5 health each, which is a huge difference. Sagittarius Squad is super popular as well, because every turn, at the end of your turn, they're going to deal 2 damage to someone. So very reliable source of damage. If the enemy Warlord has no units, that 2 damage is always being done on him. Otherwise, they're weakening the enemy units as well, or even killing them, depending on how much health there is. The only downside is you don't get to choose where that 2 damage gets done, but hey, damage is damage. It's always useful. So these guys are very popular all the way through the ladder too. Timed Melta Bomb is a little bit less popular, just because it sounds great, but it only has 4 health. It's so threatening that the enemy will usually find a way of destroying it before it gets to take action. especially if you're facing Durak Rask of the Death Guard, because his special ability is if he attacks a structure, that structure is automatically destroyed. Now, Time Melt-A-Bomb is a really juicy target for Durak to hit because it only does 1 damage to him. So this card is generally not used. The one thing is you'll often see it now used with Night Lords decks because the Recon Claw card will give a unit the flank ability. And so Night Lords players will often include Time Melt-A-Bomb, so that Recon Claw gives it flank, so Time Melt-A-Bomb can activate itself as soon as it gets deployed. Usually it has to wait until the next turn in order to use its ability, by which time it's dead already. Cool. Next up, Delta Omega 03. This is a vehicle for the Mechanicum. I like this guy. I used to use it in an Alpha Legion deck. It's got enough health to have a pretty good chance of surviving to the next turn, and anyone who it damages gets stunned, so that those units can't act in their next turn. I like this. It can be useful. Its worst enemy is frontline, because the enemy will often sacrifice a frontline unit to get stunned instead of one of its valuable ones. But this card is pretty usable, I think, still. Oops, that's not it. Next up is Forge Complex. This can be great. One of the biggest dangers in the game is running out of cards in your hand. If you find that the way your deck is built, you're playing too many cards early on and then you're running out of cards, try and put a Forge Complex in your deck, because that's going to generate a unit for you every turn on top of whatever you draw out of your deck. So you can potentially suddenly become very competitive, and if you're lucky, you'll even get some rare and epic and legendary units getting created instead. Gamma Psi 24. This guy's boring, nothing special. He's just super average, does not really get used much at all. 5 energy. He's got 6 health, which is above average for 5 energy, but 4 attack, which is slightly below average. So you rarely see this. It's just standard, nothing extraordinary. Gamma Theta gets used quite a lot. So this guy is a defensive unit, and initially his stats don't look great. 3 attack and 4 health. But during the enemy's turn, which is when you need him to be defending, he'll have 6 attacks. So anyone who tries to take him out is quite likely to get killed. But the downside is during your own turn, it's not that great at attacking and not worth attacking with for a 5 energy unit. I've tended to use Gamma Theta 11 quite a fair bit, just because as a defensive unit it can be very strong. If only it had 4 health, but hey, a medical Mechadendrite can fix that, right? Romu 31. So this is an epic card. Stats suck. It's got a great ability, but the downside is you rarely see enough vehicles to justify including this in your deck. So I would normally pass on this guy. Although, by the way, although it looks like an infantry or guy in the description, it's actually a vehicle. So just watch out for that, because Durak Rask will eat this thing up. Sigma Phi, I love this unit. It's got decent stats for 5 energy, like it's threatening, the enemy will have to take it out. But when it rallies, it jams an enemy troop, so it gets rid of all special abilities and all bonuses affecting an enemy troop. Yes, 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 I love this card. I'll often include 2 of them in many decks. Skitarii Protector is a really solid defensive unit. It's, for its stats alone, it's actually worth including. Its backlash ability is just icing on top. So a random enemy with stealth will lose stealth when Skitarii Protector dies. This card is nice. I like it. I will include it as a defensive unit. Alpha Omega 05. Fantastic offense, terrible health for 6 energy. Your enemy will kill it reasonably easy by this point. I never managed to get much mileage out of this. So although it looks impressive, it's probably one of the cheapest units with this much damage. Its health is just too low to be reliable, so put that out of mind. Chimu 25. This is the Mechanicum's second healing unit. It's okay. Like, for 6 energy, its attack and health are slightly below what you'd like, but when it goes into play, it heals up to 4 points of health by healing 2 points of health on each side. And it has this remove poison ability, but poison is used uncommonly, especially higher in the ladder, so you rarely get to benefit from that. It's okay. Most of the time for healing, people prefer the 3 energy Pi Alpha unit because that heals 3 to a single unit, and most of the time you're desperately trying to keep your Warlord alive. But this guy can come in later, give you a little bit of healing, and then he's got respectable attack and defense values for actually fighting later on. Eta Kappa 00. This card looks incredible until you look at its special ability. At the end of each turn, that means both the enemy's turn and your turns, Eta Kappa gets stunned and skips its next turn basically if it's the only unit you control. Now the thing to watch out for is if you have jamming abilities, you can jam Eta Kappa and get rid of the stun, at least, and then it becomes pretty powerful. But if you don't have jamming on hand and you're running out of units and maybe you don't have anyone stealthed, Eta Kappa is likely to be an expensive statue for you doing nothing at all. Photon Thruster. This is kind of underrated. A lot of people ignore it because it costs 6 energy, it only has 3 attack, and when its special ability only does 3 damage. But that jamming can flip the game around. Because you can often jam a critical unit of the enemy, which stops them from taking advantage of a really big special ability and helps you to win. So I like these guys. I think they're underused. Try them out, see how you feel about them. If you include them in your deck, remember the special ability and that you really want to jam out the enemy's special troops, as opposed to trying to use this as just a straightforward damage thing. Remier. This guy is super popular. So you play him, he's got stealth and he's got sneak attack. So he hides, he's hard to kill, and when he attacks he takes no damage. The only watch out is that if he kills the unit he's attacking, he returns to your hand. So that can be great because it means you can play him next turn, but it means you can't attack back to back with Remier 2 turns in a row if he kills his target the first time round. So just watch out for that. Thalax Cohort. This is a defensive unit. Actually no, it's not a defensive unit, sorry. This is an offensive unit. In theory, this would be great against people with stealth, because at the beginning of each of your turns, a random enemy with stealth loses it. The downside is that people with stealth, players who rely on stealth, hate this guy, and they will drop everything they can to kill him before the start of your turn. And coming in late in the game at the 6 energy turn, there's a lot of stuff people can do for 6 energy to kill something with 6 health. So it's an okay card. It's just that it tends to have a gigantic target painted on it. So if it survives, it'll get you. If it survives and you play it against somebody who's relying on stealth, it'll get you good mileage. Alrighty, what's next? Defiler Prototype. You never see this thing outside of events. The reason for that is it's only got 4 health, but it'll do devastating damage to the enemy if it survives. It has Bloodthirst, so it's going to attack twice. So it's going to be doing 14 damage in your next turn, but people will try to kill it as soon as they can. It's very hard to keep Defiler Prototype alive until the next turn. The only time you really see it being used is during events when people don't have control over the decks they have, and that's the only time when Defiler has a chance of surviving until the next turn. In the constructed player ladder, it will die too quickly, so just save the room in your deck, save your 7 energy, don't use Defiler Prototype. Eviscerator Engine is interesting. It used to be very popular until the Salamanders were able to do this trick better and cheaper, but it's a pretty solid ability. The unit has enough health to have a decent chance of surviving till the next turn, and if it survives and you set things up right for it, it can kill a ton of enemies in 1 turn. So I like Eviscerator Engine. I just struggle to find good opportunities to use it now. Again, being a vehicle, having 6 health, coming in at 7th turn, it's a little bit too easy to kill. But early in the ladder, you may be able to get good mileage from this thing and pull off some hilarious wins. Maniple Gamma Mu. This is a powerful frontline unit. It just rarely gets used because of that incredibly high cost. But if you include it and you play it and the enemy does not have a good way of getting rid of vehicles, it's going to be a gigantic pain for them. because during their turn it has 7 attack and 8 health, and it's front line, so you have to hit it first. So often they'll throw themselves at this this wall is going to beat them down hard. Its cousin, Maniple Gamma Rho, is sort of the same thing but without front line and with slightly less health. This is super average. You don't see it getting used because for 7 energy, people tend to include above average units from other decks instead. Speaking of 7 energy and above average, this is a better use of 7 energy points. Spirit of Mars is a tactic. It'll draw 3 Mechanicum troops out of your deck and then cut their costs. So it means the turn after you play Spirit of Mars, you'll suddenly be able to pour a ton of units out onto the board. I like that. I like that a lot. Also, sometimes if you use Spirit of Mars late in the game, in the 10th turn, if the troops you drew all cost 3 or less initially, you can actually play all those units in one turn. Urtzi Malevolus. This is a legendary card. It's got great attack, very poor health, and it does have a fantastic rally ability if the enemy is using vehicles. And I keep saying this with the Mechanicum deck, that it's got a lot of anti-vehicle abilities. It's just vehicles are not super common, or even like super strong vehicles are not really common, and so it's a little bit of a waste often to play Urtzi. Of course, whenever you do actually face an incredibly strong vehicle, you will wish you had this card in your hand. Doombringer is very popular, and that's because at the end of the turn where you deploy it, and every other turn, it does 2 damage to everybody. I love this card. It also has a healthy attack value. It's got enough health that it's not a pushover to kill, but it's unlikely to survive one more turn after you deploy it. But it does mean you at least get 1 turn where it's done 2 damage to everybody, and then hopefully killed 1 more unit during the enemy's turn as they're trying to kill this thing off. Next up, Coriel Zeth. So this is a legendary card. It's okay. Its stats are nothing to write home about, but she does come with shield, so that helps her to stay alive for a turn, and with stats this high, the enemy will be trying to kill her. So it's not bad, and her backlash ability will kill a random enemy troop. If you're unlucky, it's going to kill some weak piddly guy. On the other hand, if you're really lucky, it'll destroy the most powerful enemy unit out there. Who knows? There are better legendary cards in other decks, especially in Space Marine decks, but she is, by legendary standards, I would say she's very, very slightly below average. So if you've got nothing better, she's okay to include. Machinator Squad. This sounds great in theory, but for 8, their cost is way too high. If this ability was on a cheaper unit, it would get used a lot, but their cost is too high. At this energy cost, there are better things you can throw out. So I say no. And I've never seen a Machinator Squad being used. Telemote is similarly a bit underwhelming. He's actually the only demon in the Mechanicum deck. His rally ability stun all enemy vehicles. There are very few times that there's multiple vehicles out there, or frankly even a single vehicle out at 8 energy. He's so situation specific, it's not worth it. So no. For 8 energy, Coriel Zeth is way better. Lambda Zeta 01. This card is fantastic. It has 9 health, so it's really tough to kill. It has 5 attack, which is okay, but has cleave 5, so it attacks up to 3 different targets, doing 5 damage to them all. I like this. In a neutral deck, it has a place. It's rare to see it elsewhere because many other decks plan on either winning by the turn where you can play this, or they've got access to better units for 9 energy. But among the Mechanicum cards, this one is very strong. Just try to keep it alive for a turn after you play it. So have some frontline units out there to protect it, and hope the enemy does not have a tactic which will destroy this. If it survives, it can really wreck them. Alright. Next up is Lucas Crom. So he's a legendary card. His stats are alright. If he survives till the next turn, you can get a free Cabin Machine. People generally don't like the Cabin Machines because we're going to see them in a moment. They've got incredible stats, but they attack a random target, and that's just not reliable. Because of that, Lucas Crom is not recommended to include, because you're going to get a unit you can't really control. So before we go look at that cabin machine, which is what he generates, we look at neutron irradiator. This is a bit underwhelming. It's a really expensive unit with good health. It only does 5 damage, and yes, it stuns the units it's hitting, but for a 9 energy unit, well, it jams the units it hits as well, but for a 9 energy unit, doing only 5 damage is frankly pathetic. So there are better ways to spend your 9 energy. And almost at the end now, we look at cabin machine. So the cabin machine has shield, which is fantastic. It has 10 attack, which is fantastic. It's got 10 health, which is fantastic. But it attacks by itself, meaning it attacks a random target at the beginning of its turn. Meaning that 10 attack is quite likely going to get wasted on a unit with 1 or 2 health. Because of that, it's just not reliable. Don't put this in your deck. Lastly, Manipul Tau Mu. This is totally sub-average. 10 energy cost, but it's the only 10 energy cost unit in the game which has no special abilities at all. So you do not want to bother with this guy. He's kind of pointless. Many other ways to spend 10 energy. Like even from the Mechanicum deck, instead of 10 energy, I'd rather have Lambda Zeta for 9 energy. Alright. So with that, I think I've covered the Mechanicum deck. So in the next video which I'll be posting, I will be showing you now how to build a deck, and we'll build a Gavriel Loken deck. So please subscribe if you want to get notified when that video goes up. It's going to come up at some point in the next couple of days. I hope you found this useful, and yeah, please subscribe. Alright, see you guys soon. Bye.